70 miles off the coast of Scotland lies a rock so remote, even the ocean seems to abandon it. In December 1900, 3 seasoned lighthouse keepers were stationed on this unforgiving island. But on the dark night of December 15th, the guiding light of the Flannan Isles suddenly vanished. When a rescue crew finally breached the heavy iron doors days later, the silence was deafening. The meals were left completely untouched on the wooden table. Their heavy waterproof coats were still hanging on the wall, meaning they stepped out into the freezing Scottish winter without them. 3 grown men had simply evaporated into thin air. But it was the final entry in their official logbook that chilled investigators to the bone. It read, "Severe storm. The wind is deafening, and the men are crying." Except, meteorological records prove that on that exact day, the Scottish seas were completely dead calm. Welcome to Classified Britannia. Today, we open the restricted files on the impossible disappearance at the Flannan Isles. Chapter I, the Blackout. The Flannan Isles, known locally as the Seven Hunters, have always carried a dark reputation. For centuries, shepherds refused to stay on the islands overnight, whispering of ancient spirits that haunted the jagged rocks. But the British government needed a lighthouse to guide ships through the treacherous Atlantic waters. In 1899, a towering 75-foot structure was completed. It was a marvel of Victorian engineering, built to withstand the wrath of the ocean. Manning this fortress were 3 highly experienced men: James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. MacArthur, in particular, was a hardened sea veteran, known across the Scottish coast for his fearless nature. For a year, the lighthouse operated flawlessly. Then came December 15th, 1900. A passing merchant ship, the Arctur, was navigating through the pitch-black waters. The captain looked towards the Flannan Isles, expecting the familiar, comforting beam of light. There was nothing. Only total, absolute darkness. Due to severe weather that followed in the coming days, a relief ship, the Hesperus, could not reach the island until December 26th. As the ship approached the island in the cold morning light, Captain Jim Harvey sounded the ship's horn. A massive blast echoed across the empty cliffs. They waited for the keepers to emerge. No one answered. The flagstaff was bare. The provision boxes were empty. A deep, unsettling dread fell over the crew. Chapter 2, The Empty Tower. Relief keeper Joseph Moore was the first man to volunteer to step onto the island. He climbed the steep, winding stone stairs up to the lighthouse. The heavy entrance door was firmly closed and locked from the inside. Moore forced his way in, shouting the names of his friends into the echoing stone chamber. The silence that answered him was suffocating. Inside, the scene was entirely wrong. The large kitchen clock had completely stopped. On the table, a meal of cold meats and potatoes sat perfectly plated, entirely untouched. One of the heavy wooden chairs was knocked over, violently pushed back, suggesting someone had stood up in an absolute panic. But the most disturbing detail was found in the cloakroom. It was the middle of a freezing Scottish winter, yet one of the thick, waterproof oilskin coats was still hanging on its peg. Whoever left the lighthouse in that final, desperate moment had run out into the freezing, deadly elements without their protective gear. It defied all logic of survival. Moore ran up the claustrophobic spiral staircase, checking the sleeping quarters, the storage rooms, and finally the glass lantern room at the very top. The oil lamps were cleaned and trimmed. The beds were neatly made. Everything was in perfect, pristine order. But the 3 men were gone. Chapter 3, The Impossible Logbook. When investigators from the mainland arrived, they immediately searched for the official lighthouse logbook. They needed to know what happened in those final days. What they found only deepened the horror. The entries leading up to their disappearance were written by Thomas Marshall. On December 12th, he wrote of gale-force winds. He noted that James Duckett, the principal keeper, had been unusually quiet, and that Donald MacArthur, the tough, fearless veteran, had been crying. Let that sink in. A hardened Scottish sailor, a man who had faced the worst the Atlantic had to offer, was weeping in the dark. On December 13th, the log stated the storm had continued. Marshall wrote that all three men had been praying for deliverance in a state-of-the-art, secure stone fortress. Then came the final chilling entry on December 15th. It simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." There were no more entries. The words painted a picture of men driven to absolute psychological terror by a massive storm. But here is the terrifying anomaly that science cannot explain. Weather stations on the nearby Isle of Lewis recorded the conditions for December 12th, 13th, and 14th. There were no severe storms. The weather was reported as relatively calm. The massive, terrifying tempest that drove these experienced men to tears and desperate prayer did not exist on any meteorological record. So, what storm were they fighting? What forces were battering the lighthouse that only they could see and hear? The official government inquiry concluded that a massive, freak rogue wave must have swept the men off the cliff while they were trying to secure equipment. It is a neat, logical explanation that closes the file, but it does not explain the locked doors. It does not explain the untouched meals or the missing coats. And it certainly does not explain a phantom storm recorded by men who were terrified out of their minds. Some say the isolation simply drove them mad. Others believe the ancient legends of the seven hunters were true, and the island finally claimed the trespassers, who built a tower on its sacred ground. Today, the Flannan Isles lighthouse is fully automated. No human keepers are required. But the mystery of 1900 remains perfectly preserved, locked within those cold stone walls. What do you believe happened to the three men of the Flannan Isles? Mainstream media will ignore the anomalies. Subscribe to Classified Britannia and turn on notifications for more deep dives into the UK's most restricted files. Until the next file is opened, keep the lights on